Colin had a tantrum, and a big, big tantrum. And the nurses referred to it as hysterics, which is kind of funny because the word hysterics derives from the Greek word for woman. So a little boy having hysterics is just weird, and that's not. Anyway, hysterics, yelling, screaming, and had this huge tantrum. And Mary listened to it, and she didn't get a well. At first, she was annoyed, and then annoyed turned into anger. And that's a very common thing, that when there's this little thing that's annoying, and it doesn't hurt, it isn't bad, but it's just sort of there at the edge of your mind, and it's pricking and poking and just won't go away, and it won't stop, and it just continues on and continues on and continues on, and it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse until you're angry. So that happened with Mary. She heard the screaming, and she's like, somebody has got to stop this. So she stormed out of her room, high dander, just angry, stormed into Colin's room and yelled at him. Now, the nurse encouraged this because the nurse couldn't yell at Colin, even though she knew he probably needed it. And, he needed to be brought down to earth. He needed to be set right. He needed to be done so. It needed to be done to him forcefully. But she couldn't do it herself because she was a servant. And in those times, you had the masters and you had the servants. And she could have been fired just right away if Colin said, no, get rid of her, get another nurse. And it would have been very difficult for her to get another position if she had been fired, because the first thing that they would do is check references. And if you don't get references, that's like, oh, the person must be a thief or something, and you won't get fired without references. And she wouldn't get references if she was fired. So here you have Colin, and the nurse is afraid of him, and everyone else, Martha's afraid of him. Everyone's afraid of him because he can get them fired and sent away. Now, Mary's in an interesting position because she's a relative, and she has no other real relatives. The worst thing that will happen to her is that she will be locked up in her room, or she will be sent away to a far part of the manor, and she'll be sent away and locked away into a different part of the manor, but there's not really much that can be done to her. And also, she's so young that she probably doesn't realize that she is in this privileged position. All she knows is that Colin woke her up. Colin is screaming. Colin is making a mess. He's just tired of Colin, and she's like, no, shut up. He's like, I found a lump. You did not find a lump. And it's amazing what we can convince ourselves of when we think there's something wrong. It's like, oh no, I have this weird bump here on my forehead. It's like, no. Or, oh, I have this terrible... And you can convince yourself, and you'll start to notice it and look at it and find it. And so he convinced himself that he had the lump, and so he did it. And Mary was convinced that there was no lump. So unless it was this large, obvious thing, because her predilection, her choice was to not see it. She wouldn't see it unless it was something glaringly obvious. While Colin, deciding to see it, found it in anything. So she yelled at him, and he was just like, ah. And so that was useful for, breaking him down. And maybe tomorrow he'll get to go outside. He's really looking forward to going outside, so that's a good thing. Mary took control of the whole situation, because once again, she's in a privileged position. Of the people who are running the house, of the masters of the house, you have Colin and his father and Mary, and they are the only people in the ruling group here. Even Mrs. Medlack, she's still a servant, and she could still be put away. And she has that hanging over her head. But here you have Mary, who is one of the nominal ruling people, and she takes charge. And sometimes being in charge is nothing more than taking charge. First aid class. One of the things that the first thing you do with CPR is you establish control over the scene. And it's like, okay, any doctors around? You verify that there isn't somebody better at this than you. And then if you don't get an immediate answer, it's you point to somebody and you say, you, go call 911. You, do this. And then you start CPR. And so you have someone going out and calling 911. And you take control of the situation. And just taking control of the situation, just by saying, I'm in charge, you're in charge. Famously, the White House chief of staff, after Ronald Reagan was shot, said, the people need to know that there's somebody in charge, and I'm in charge. Well, no, he wasn't. He wasn't anywhere on the list of people who ever become in charge when no, chief of staff is no, it's not even a cabinet. Chief of staff is pretty much never in charge. But he said he was in charge, and people followed his orders because he said he was in charge. George H.W. Bush, was actually the one in charge. But so just by saying, I'm in charge in the situation, you can be in charge until actual authority manifests itself. Something else. Mary said hysterics over and over and over again. And later on at the end of the book, she said perhaps, 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 perhaps. And something that I've found is that when you say a word over and over and over again, it just sort of loses its meaning and just becomes sounds. Hysterics, 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 hysterics. It just becomes gibberish words. Perhaps, 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 perhaps. And, you just kind of listen to the sounds of the words, but it doesn't really mean anything because you're just hearing it repeat over and over again. So that's an interesting thing to pay attention to, because it can be used as a form of hypnosis. And a lot of Mary's telling Colin about the story was actually a sort of hypnosis, where you get the person's brain into a pattern. And once you get their brain into a pattern, the rational thought just kind of shuts down, and you can just sort of lead them into where you want to go. So Mary, unknowingly, was doing some hypnosis of Colin there just to get him to sleep. So that's kind of a cool thing. And that's kind of a cool thing.